I try a lot of modern decks actually, and the decks that I end up trying are off the beaten path a lot, and I try them thinking that I'm gonna find some way to attack the format that nobody has thought of before. And they always seem much better in theory than they do in practice. So whenever I can't find a deck where I'm comfortable with all the matchups, I return to the only deck where I know all the matchups through each tournament to keep playing it successfully. My name is Alex Mazlaton. I'm playing Affinity in Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch. So Affinity is an artifact aggro synergy deck. It often plays 0 to 1 cards with the actual Affinity mechanic. That's just a holdover from when the cards were first printed. But it is a very synergy-based deck around having a lot of artifacts in play. The key cards are Arcbound Ravager, which you can grow by sacrificing your artifacts, and Cranial Plating, which gives you a bonus based on how many artifacts you have in play. So if you play out a lot of cheap artifacts and play one of those 2 cards, all of your cards can work together to deal the opponent a lot of damage very quickly. The mana base I played for this tournament, I'm playing 8 Nexus creatures, 4 Inkmoth and 4 Blinkmoth Nexus. I'm playing 4 Darksteel Citadels, 3 Glimmer Voids, a mountain, and an island. Also, non-land mana sources, I have 4 Mox Opals and 4 Springleaf Drums. The creatures I have in my list, I have a lot more creatures than I usually do. I think my creature count is 28. 4 copies of basically all the strong creatures. 4 Arcbound Ravagers, 4 Master of Ethereum, 4 Signal Pest, 4 Steel Overseer, and then I'm playing 4 of almost all the nuts and bolts creatures. I'm playing 4 Ornithopters and 4 Vault Scourges, and I'm playing 3 Memnites. I'm also playing 1 Spellskite main deck. The other spells I'm playing, aside from the mana cards, are just Cranial Plating and 2 copies of Ensoul Artifact and 1 copy of Galvanic Blast. Ensoul Artifact is great right now, I feel, because 2 of its biggest weaknesses were removal cards like Abrupt Decay and Path to Exile. And my prediction on the modern metagame was that there would be a lot of very fast decks that were not interactive. So Ensoul gives you a lot of extra speed since you can play it on an artifact, and it essentially is a 5/5 with haste. It has 2 basic strategies. Strategy number 1 is to flood the board with a lot of cheap artifact creatures and swarm the opponent. And it uses cards like Signal Pest and Arcbound Ravager to help do that. And I say Arcbound Ravager because you can get a lot of chip damage in really early with a lot of creatures to go wide. But then to finish them off, you can always sneak 1 blocker in and then grow it really big with Ravager. The other strategy is to just make 1 really large evasive creature to start with and kill them in 1 or 2 hits. And you could do that with Arcbound Ravager or Cranial Plating. And especially now, Master of Ethereum is starting to see a lot of play again, and that creature is just big all by itself. My sideboard, for this tournament, I'm playing 3 Etched Champions in the sideboard. I'm playing 2 copies of Whip Flare, 2 copies of Girapur Aether Grid, 2 copies of Ancient Grudge, 2 copies of Grafdigger's Cage, 2 copies of Stubborn Denial, and then 1 copy of Gutshot, and 1 copy of Whip Flare, and then 1 copy of Seagate Wreckage. The Etched Champions are for the Black-Green X grindy type matchups, or sometimes there's a lot of blue-red decks that play a lot of removal cards. Beyond that, the rest of the sideboard cards are very dual purpose, and that's kind of how you have to build Affinity sideboards. You can't board in a lot of cards without disrupting the engine of the deck, so you have to find sideboard cards that are really versatile, that are useful in a lot of different matchups. For example, Girapur Aether Grids are really strong against token decks, Lingering Souls type decks, and it's also really strong in the mirror. So that's 1 card that I can bring in at least 2 different matchups. And the same goes for Stubborn Denial. Stubborn Denial is really strong against control decks and combo decks. And then I have a little bit of Graveyard Hate in Grafdigger's Cage. It's really effective against decks playing Snapcaster Mage and Jace Vryn's Prodigy, because when Jace flips, you can cast cards out of the graveyard with it, and Grafdigger's Cage kind of stops that altogether. The way Modern is, it's very hard to have a matchup where you can win it every time, but I will say that I'm really comfortable playing against the control decks that are not super fast, that don't have a ton of cheap interaction. Those decks typically have a hard time drawing the right mix of early interaction spells and win conditions. So either they can kill all my stuff early and then I can just draw more stuff to outlast them, or they don't have enough interactive cards that cost 1 and 2 mana, and I can find a way to kill them before they can even get 3 or 4 lands down. So those are the matchups that I like a lot. And then there are a lot of matchups that I'm just playing faster than, that we don't interact at all. So I would say those two types of decks are the decks that I mostly want to play against. Affinity is definitely my favorite deck of all time, and it's not really competitive in Legacy, at least that's my opinion. So Modern is really the only format I can play it. And I would say that Affinity is one of the harder decks to play in Modern. Affinity is very much a deck where you live and die by 1 or 2 points of damage, and to win more games with Affinity, you have to be able to squeeze out every last point of damage, and you can often not miss a single one. And if you're especially just picking up the deck, it's really hard to see all of them all the time because the cards are so synergistic and you have to pay a lot of attention to how they work with each other. So Affinity is certainly not easy, and if you want to play it, I would recommend practicing a lot.